Are we recording? Excellent. Welcome, listeners all, to this fireside chat. I'm kidding. I'm doing a journal club today. Uh, Randal Koene here, doing a journal club on subjective experience and AKA consciousness. More about that on the next slide. And doing a computational neuroscience approach to this. So I will not be discussing at length the metaphysics of consciousness. Instead, I'll be diving straight into what is the type of approach that the Carbon Copies Foundation is taking when discussing and trying to make sure that we take care of how subjective experience is included in the emulation when we do whole brain emulation. So with that, on to the next slide. Now, we have very recently had a meeting in the Carbon Copies Foundation Glossary project, where we decided to tackle consciousness, to tackle that term and to define how the Carbon Copies Foundation uses that term. We're doing this with a lot of different terminology at the moment, and consciousness was obviously an important one. One of the things that we discovered immediately was that it is not very useful to be using vague terms when you have more explicit terms available, more narrow terms available for the thing you're trying to talk about. So our decision was primarily that because consciousness is used in many different ways, two of the most important ones are listed here. Namely, consciousness sometimes means the subjective experience that someone is having, and sometimes it means the state of being awake or aware in the medical sense, which is best described by its opposite, not unconscious. So you're not whatever unconscious means. And the usage here, examples, patient lost consciousness due to the anesthesia, or recently MRI has been used to identify consciousness in locked-in patients. These are helpful. And the most important point for us was, number one, see subjective experience. There is a term that is less easily conflated with all of the other things that we can use for the thing that most often is implied or meant when people mean consciousness and they're talking about whole brain emulation, mind uploading, and all those associated things. And that is this notion of subjective experience. So we decided that the smart thing for Carbon Copies authors to do, and that includes people giving a journal club presentation, is to use the term subjective experience instead of consciousness when it is in fact subjective experience that they're talking about. And I see that Lennon has a question with the slide. Please do ask.
I was wondering if you wanted help moderating.
Yeah, you can moderate for me if you want to.
Okay, we've already got Lennon, so.
Yeah, so my question was, how does the Rawlsian definition, or the Rawlsian account, if you will, contrast with or play into the second use of the term? That is to say, as far as I recall correctly, that according to Rawls, that there is something like to be something else. Like, for example, a bat is, I believe, the example that he uses. You might even say that, like, to put oneself in the shoes of a thing is to say that it has a conscious
To my
experience.
mind, that all is within number one, the subjective experience. I do not believe that about what is it like to be a bat is much about whether the bat is awake or unconscious.
Okay.
So the medical test that you can apply to see whether your patient is responding, I don't think has a lot to do with that question. Whether your patient is a bat or a human.
Mm-hmm.
You can always check for pupillary dilations and all that stuff, right? Not sure
So do
about
you
bats
think
and pupillary dilations, but okay. Yeah. So
you
sure.
think that has a very close parallel to the first definition then?
I think that it all falls within that one. I think that questions about what's it like to be a bat and about all of these related questions are typically about consciousness when it actually means the subjective experience. So what is the subjective experience of a bat like versus what is the subjective experience of a human like, or of Bill or Anita or whomever, right? If that's clear enough, I'll carry on. I have some goals for this talk. Okay, and I see that Anita perhaps still had a question about the previous slide.
What was Alicia?
Sorry, Alicia, yes.
I made a comment in the chat. I think a lot of authors use consciousness to mean awareness of awareness, or this like a different. I think there's a third definition. I'm wondering why it's not included there.
What does awareness of awareness mean?
Well, I'm not sure exactly, but when I read consciousness, I feel like it's not always talking about subjective experience or being awake, but also this kind of like meta consciousness of being aware that we're conscious.
Yeah,
It
so
is-
I'm
Like,
not
I
sure
think
exactly
there's
what
more
to do with this.
discrepancy than just two definitions.
Adding meta in front of consciousness just makes the whole thing even more vague, and saying awareness of awareness to me also doesn't really clarify. I mean, if there is a specific example of something that doesn't fall in subjective experience and that doesn't fall in the second meaning, then indeed we can add a third one. This was not meant to be exhaustive. That's why it said consciousness principal meanings, and maybe we didn't even include all principal meanings. I see that Anita has her hand up.
Something I just wanted to note about the carbon copies glossary is it wasn't supposed to be an exhausted representation of how the word is meant in the world. Like there are people that use consciousness to mean personal identity, for instance, but at the Carbon Copies Foundation, we don't use it that way. And what the glossary project is trying to tease out is when it's said officially by somebody in the Carbon Copies Foundation, what does it mean? So what does
it mean in our writing, in our
right
presentation?
in the context
That's the word.
only of the Carbon Copies Foundation? And typically we might, and we haven't hit all of this yet. It is a project that's still very much underway, and consciousness is not a defined term in the end. But instead of saying consciousness to describe awareness of awareness, we might say self-awareness or meta-awareness or something like that.
Self-awareness.
Awareness of being
Okay.
conscious.
Awareness of being conscious. Okay, which I suppose is a subset of subjective experience, right? Because being aware
Awareness
of being
of
awake
awareness.
is a part of being aware, so having subjective experience. Okay, and
So how
before
did
we get to
Anita
Lennon's
say it
question,
differently
sorry, Alicia, yes?
So how did Anita say it differently than I did?
Oh, I don't think
Because
I did. I don't think I did. I think I was.
Well, when I say awareness of awareness, Randall seems to think it's like
No,
confusing
it's just that
something you've never heard
Anita.
of. But when you say awareness of consciousness, all of a sudden it makes sense. I'm just curious.
No. I'm not saying it makes it more clear at all. I'm just, as I was processing it further, awareness of awareness, I was coming to the conclusion that it probably is a subset of subjective experience because of how it's the awareness of being awake. So that was just me gradually getting to a more of an understanding of what's going on. But before we get to Lennon's raised hand, I just want to mention that what Anita was saying about the glossary project is true, and we are trying to use the terms more the way the glossary project is beginning to define how Carbon Copies uses them. As part of that, because the additional suggestion in the definition that the glossary project came up with, for good reasons, I am trying to switch to using the term subjective experience in order to not conflate with the other possible meanings for this talk. So I decided that even though the glossary is still in the works, I was going to start trying to use what we're coming up with there here instead of just vaguely talking about consciousness all the way through. Lennon, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that regarding to the awareness of awareness, that perhaps sentience might be a word that encapsulates that idea, or perhaps that might even be a definition for sentience that we could consider adding to the glossary.
Is that so? So sentience would be another word for awareness of awareness?
Well, maybe that awareness of awareness might be a necessary condition for sentience, perhaps. But I think you could maybe also make the case that it is perhaps a principal component.
I'll go ahead
Looks
and
like
write
there's
that
another
down.
word to define there.
Yeah, so that we can so Randall, you can move on, but I will write both of those things down, or all the things that you and Alicia mentioned. Randall.
Okay, I will move on. Okay, the goals of this talk. They are multiple. Establish reasonable consensus about the nature and dependencies of subjective experience. Where subjective experience, so the things that I want people to come out of this with are subjective experience is a process, not a momentary state. In other words, you cannot actually be conscious in the moment. It's not a state. It's not a momentary thing. Statements about subjective experience are post hoc. They're intrinsically linked to memory. Memory is absolutely necessary to make statements about consciousness. Subjective experience is constrained by the limitations of the types of memory it depends on, particularly working memory, which we know has some limitations, such as the number of items, whatever those items may be, that you can hold in memory at the same time. So these are the goals, and I hope that we can get to those. So starting right up with the beginning here, you see one of my goals was, it's not a state. We'll begin with a piece of evidence or something that we tend to agree on. Dead brains are not conscious, right? You bury a brain, you put them in the ground. That brain, we say, this is not a conscious person that we're burying. Consequences of that agreement sounds plausible. Jesse's trying to come up with a counterexample. Okay.
Sorry, that was the response to Hannah.
All right. The consequences of this are that if dead brains are not conscious, even though they have all the same connectome and all the same sort of state is there, except maybe that there is, you can't really say that the electrons that happen to be there. There are, of course, electrons. There are always electrons in matter, but they're not flowing in a certain way at that point because there's no process going on. This subjective experience is not the data state of a brain at a given moment, any more than, say, a book could be conscious because it just contains all the information about what was in that brain at that time. Or, the data that we get out of a connectome that we've scanned. Just because we have a connectome and then we took electron microscope scans and then we put all that data in a computer doesn't mean that we now have a conscious brain in the computer. This also has implications for things like, for example, these putative Boltzmann brains that have been hypothesized. This idea that, well, a star has so many different atoms and they go through so many patterns that it's very likely that at some point a star somewhere is going to have a pattern that is essentially the same as the pattern of the brain of some person, right? So just because that pattern is there doesn't mean that you now have a conscious being in that star, because in that star there isn't the necessary process from state to state that would make it make sense as an experience of subjective experience, right, of that consciousness. So instead, subjective experience is a type of signal processing, where the signal is the thing that carries the information, and you're processing it in a certain way. I saw a hand go up for this slide. Angela.
Hi, sorry, it was me. I had a bit of a daft question which started off something in chat. How do you define that a brain is dead?
How do you define that a brain is dead? I guess, yeah, I could be more clear. I could say the brains of dead people are not conscious. Wow, who had their hand up first there? Anita, maybe it's better that you are doing this moderating because I can't keep track of the hands going up in a certain order.
I think it might have been mine twice because I had some extra clicking happening. But my suggestion was that a dead brain is one that is no longer dynamic, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's permanently dead. I'm not talking about total human death. A brain might be largely not dynamic and then able to start being dynamic again. But I think maybe for the purposes of what we're talking
about, it doesn't have the normal dynamics of a live
Right.
brain. It's the dynamics that it still has are the dynamics of decay, in a sense, but no longer
Exactly.
the dynamics of a living brain. Okay.
I don't know if that's helpful, Angela, but that was what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was just wondering, did you say there was a lack of electrical activity or, but I fear that otherwise poor Randall's never going to get through a slide, so I'll go away and shut up.
It's okay. I mean, I know there are some important calls coming up right after the journal club. Arseny is going to be chatting with someone, and I hope to join that conversation. But if we go long and the same people don't mind us going long, then it's no problem. We'll see. All right, I need to have a way of getting this little thing out of the way that says you are sharing. Okay, there we go. The next slide, cogito ergo sum and making judgments. So here I'm going to try to start talking about what's happening in subjective experience, at least the way I see it, just from looking at it in terms of the flow of signals, just looking at the computational neuroscience side of it, which is really the signal flow. I am conscious because I am or was aware of what you just said. I don't really like the am part, but that's what someone would normally say. They would normally put it in the present tense. I really think it should be in the past tense. That's why I added the was. I'm conscious because I was aware of what you just said. What does it really take to make that claim? And just to be clear, we should be starting here with the audiovisual input. There was some that was a click. There was some audiovisual input to the brain of the person who's making this statement. Eventually, I'm not showing every little stage here. Eventually, that audiovisual input has to be processed for language. From that, you store a sequence of concepts, at least in working memory. And it has to be working memory for reasons I'll get into in just a moment. So I was aware of what you just said. At first, first thing it needs is that you're putting into working memory the processed language output, those concepts. You may also employ intermediate term memory. This is something that begins to happen almost automatically, and it's not entirely clear to me if it's necessary for the say the subjective experience part of this, but it does happen. Intermediate term memory begins to take place where LTP, long-term potentiation, is happening on the synapses in the hippocampus that is involved in this working memory process. And then prefrontal executive command comes along to confirm the experience and respond. So there is some reason why a person would say, I am conscious because I was aware of what you just said. There's a reason why they decided to say that to someone. So there is some maybe pre-existing plan or because of something that was going on in the situation, in that context, in the conversation, maybe because they were talking about, well, what is consciousness? And then they say, well, I'm conscious because I was aware of what you just said. They were in that context. So their prefrontal cortex had a plan. There is an executive command that comes along that they want to confirm that they just had a conscious experience and they want to respond about it. If you need to have more examples of what this is like, I really encourage you to watch the presentations by Susan Blackmore, who is all about this part, about what is it actually like when someone is trying to be aware of being conscious. Because this is actually this is the awareness of awareness part that we're talking about here. Now that command, it involves carrying that out, executing that command. It involves checking recent memory for evidence of the perceived conversation. So memory is already involved at this point. You have to compare with previous experiences, like what was it like to perceive that a conversation was going on. These are all things you've learned. You've set up structures in your brain to do that. You have lots of examples to choose from. You have associations that have been made. We'll get into more examples in a bit, actually. That's going to come right after the part where I show you models that are going to be hard to describe quickly. I actually think the examples are going to be very important. Those examples will help us to think through things clearly from here on. But this is just the first entry point here to see what this loop is like. So you're comparing with previous experience. You apply your learned judgment, even the judgment about what is it like to have an experience or to be aware of something. It's in a context from being a child to now where you have learned to understand what that is and to even say to someone, oh, I'm conscious. And so all of this is also including a lot of learning, a lot of cultural learning, a lot of personal learning, even making the judgment that you were just aware of something and being able to make these judgments and put them into words. There's a lot of learning involved there. So this is, again, information from your memory. And you're taking that judgment that you just made and you put that into working memory. It needs to be buffered somewhere. If it's not buffered somewhere, it's gone. Then you want to form a response, a sentence, and you instruct your vocal cords. And that's not the end of it, because at that point, the fact that you just spoke, the fact that your vocal cords just did that, produces what's called a proprioceptive feedback, so feedback from your body into your brain, that is giving you the sensation of having just spoken and of being in your body, being in this place, in this world, having just said something. That feeds back into your working memory and back into the loop. So this whole subjective experience thing is a part of being in a loop like this. And now we don't always have an ongoing stream of consciousness. This loop does break sometimes, like when you go to sleep or you're distracted by something and you're no longer thinking in the same loop, thinking about the same experience going on, but you're distracted by some other experience. Maybe a new loop starts. But there's this loop going on of input, the output you produce, and your body, and back in. So awareness of subjective experience, this happens within a working memory loop. And I'll say a little bit more about working memory in just a second, but this is a good moment to check if anyone has any immediate questions. Yes, Arseny.
Just a little clarification. Why are two of these blocks highlighted in yellow? Is this
Right?
Does it have any special meaning?
It has a slightly special meaning. The main reason I highlighted those two blocks is because when you think about what you're aware of, it feels like these two are the ones that actually rise to the point where you could say, oh, this is something that I am consciously doing, that I'm actually doing with purpose. Whereas processing visual input, understanding language, storing it in working memory, all of this stuff happens anyway, unconsciously. You don't need to do anything for that. Checking your recent memory, once you decided that you're going to check if you were aware of something, you do automatically. You compare it with previous experiences automatically. You apply all your other associations and stuff, and you put it in working memory automatically. But then, because there's someone in the conversation with you, and you're not just standing there alone, although some people do speak to themselves, you decide to form a sentence. And so this seems, again, to rise to that point where you could say, this is part of my self-model of what I'm doing. And then you instruct your vocal cords. That's, again, automatic. So that's the main difference. The yellow is just highlighting these little bits are the parts that we're actually, usually that we call what we're aware of, right? That's sort of within our self-model. All right. So subjective experience statements should be past tense. That's the title of the slide because I thought it was important to emphasize it, but really the rest of the slide goes into something a bit different. So as I already mentioned when I was going through that loop, I pointed out that the comparison that you need to make the judgment that you had a subjective experience depends on memory buffers. If that memory isn't there, then you can't make that statement. You can't say, I was aware of this. You can't say that you were conscious or that you had subjective experience. Now, what do we know about these buffers? There are some important points to take home here. First of all, they need to be functionally integrative. They have to be able to work with brain activity from all kinds of sources, because sometimes the sort of thing that you want to store is about language. Sometimes it's vision. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's feeling hot or cold. Sometimes it's coming from somewhere else. We'll have some examples that include internal sources as well. So they have to be integrative functionally. They also need to be temporally integrative, because typically, because these are processes and because the experience itself is usually a temporal phenomenon. It needs to be an episode of things that have happened. There can be more than one thing that happened in that episode, however you define thing or item or whatever you want to call it. Chunk. So temporally integrative. It's interesting that, of course, IIT instantly jumped on these things, right? It's got the integrative part down pat. They need to capture instantaneously. Synaptic modification won't do for this. Even LTP is too slow to make these buffers work. It needs to be on the level of seconds or less. Something happens and you store it right away. And I'll get to Alex's question in just a moment. There should be measurable evidence. So what we want, if we weren't going to look at, we're going to examine what these buffers are like, we want some measurable evidence of the type of buffer that's there and why it should be that kind of a buffer. We want to be able to see this evidence specifically during cognitive performance that's deemed awake and aware, as opposed to the kind of cognitive performance that happens in times when you're not conscious, or when you're asleep, or when you're just focused on something you're doing, but you're not really consciously processing and not like dealing with your self model. There are other states of being, and we would like to see that difference in the evidence that we use for those buffers. Alex, you're saying all of the information presented in the slides are those from cognitive science literature as opposed to neuroscience lit. My impression is the ongoing consciousness discussion is mainly operating at the cognitive science level. You are right. I am coming into this starting with definitions, with making things clear that are on the cognitive science level. The neuroscience part, the computational neuroscience bit, is coming up in a moment, and I hope it's not too shocking when it does, because it's kind of big. All right, so here we go. We're beginning to get right into that now. This is a bit of a deep dive. So we're talking about non-synaptic short-term buffers, which is something we don't often mention here, because when we talk about carbon copies, whole brain emulation, mind uploading, we're usually concerned about how do we capture synaptic memory that is stored in the connectome that you can find when you're scanning, and that you then, I hope Arseny manages to rejoin, that you can then, there he goes, that you can then use to recreate. Now, that's specifically not the kind of memory that we're talking about. And I'm not saying that there are no synapses involved. This is not about neurons that are floating in their environment unconnected to anything. It's about neurons that do have synaptic connections to other neurons, but there is no change of those synaptic connections needed to establish this memory or these buffers of memory. Now, what we've measured here, so here's the measured part. What have we found in times of self-awareness, of conscious awareness, subjective experience, or in the case of, say, rats, who we can't really ask whether they're consciously aware at that moment, just whether they are awake and performing some activity or processing an activity. What we have found is that there are two rhythms in the brain that are particularly elevated at that time: theta rhythm and the gamma rhythm. And when you dive in and look more clearly at those, you can see that the theta rhythm is actually driven by input from a specific part of the brain, from the thalamic region. So that it's like an input that is there during those modes of the brain, but not there in other modes, like sleeping. And the gamma rhythm. And gamma rhythm is intrinsic to a region. It's there because there are interneurons, there's neurons that reduce activity, that cause inhibition, that are connected to all of the principal neurons, where principal neurons means neurons that cause excitation, positive neurons. They inhibit everything, and the purpose of this interneuron network appears to be in every region, separated in every region, to shut down activity of the principal cells after they fire. And if you look at how long it takes for them to recover from that interneuron activity, that's what gives you the gamma rhythm. That's what gives you the frequency, the rate at which they can fire after they've been inhibited. Now, this is stuff that's been around for a long time, but the actual model for these buffers, the first time that was proposed in a real computational neuroscience model was by Lissman et al. Lissman and also his student, and who is now, of course, a professor, Ola Jensen, who did a lot of modeling on that. And this is about episodic buffers that use nested oscillations. We'll get into that more in just a moment. I just want to mention these tie-ins because it's important to realize how many different parts of evidence are coming together here and how they tie into the requirements for that non-synaptic buffer that we were just talking about. Let me just grab a quick sip here. One is this so-called phenomenon of after depolarization. If you are somewhat familiar with computational neuroscience, then you're probably aware of after hyperpolarization. That's this situation where after a neuron has fired, it takes a while for the neuron to recover, and that recovery can be expressed as a function that you can describe, this after hyperpolarization function that has a nice exponential decay. But after depolarization is the opposite. It's something that takes place at the same time, but you superimpose all these functions, and the after depolarization starts taking over after the after hyperpolarization has gone away. It only applies to specific types of neurons. It's the pyramidal neurons in the neocortex that exhibit this after depolarization as a result of some of the ion channels that they have. The after depolarization takes over after hyperpolarization, and it leads the pyramidal neurons to increase their potential beyond their resting potential. Not all the way to firing, but closer to firing. So close, in fact, that just the leftover membrane potential from previous input or previous firing is enough to make these neurons fire again. And because they fire again, and it's driven by this after depolarization, you can have a repeat of the activity that just happened in those pyramidal neurons. You only see this when there's also theta available, because the theta that's being driven by the thalamic input, that is raising the membrane potential of the neurons involved sufficiently that the after depolarization can get them to fire again. And so because the theta rhythm is involved in that, and the theta rhythm is rhythmic, it means that it also synchronizes the firing, that they will only fire again every time when theta allows them to. So it becomes clocked, in a sense. This is sustained, and it's sustained for maybe 8 seconds, maybe longer. That's certainly long enough to get LTP going, and it's also long enough typically for what you normally do with working memory. So this has given us the functional integration because it's neocortical pyramidal neurons. The neocortex spans all sorts of regions with all kinds of different function, and they all exhibit this after depolarization. It also gives us the instantaneous capture. We have something that causes neurons in the neocortex to fire, and because they're in that state where theta is going on, they will fire again and again and again. So that same pattern that just fired is going to fire again every about 125 milliseconds. Now you also have a phase offset between regions. So we'll show that in a moment as well in a model. But let's say that you have a region that is receiving visual input, and you have another region that is trying to process recognized objects and maybe tie them into experience, retrieve previous associations. You can have that there's a phase offset so that the region that is processing the visual input will process and produce its output patterns just in time for the next region that is doing the rest of the work there to receive that as input, because each of them is going to exhibit an acquisition phase and a retrieval phase in their theta. When theta is high, they're likely to retrieve because neurons are likely to fire. And so if there are neurons that are already associated through synaptic strengths for existing patterns, things you've seen before, then just firing a few of those neurons will probably retrieve all the rest in that pattern during the high theta. So retrieval phase is during high theta. In low theta, that's where you can acquire new input because there's not going to be this competing firing of retrieval. And in addition to that, beyond just these phase offsets that are observed by recording from these regions, we also see that there appears to be, when you look very carefully and closely with a microscope, synapse on synapse modulation on these data paths. So from one region to another, it's not just that synapses will attach to a neuron, they will actually attach to the terminal of another synapse. And there are specific types of synapses that do this, and they can actually inhibit the transmission of activity through the synapse that it has attached to. So it's like a path blocker. It can close the gates. It can say, right now, you cannot transmit. So this is another help for this offset between regions and deciding when it's time for input and output to occur. Now, the hippocampus, which we're going to talk about a bit more too, is involved in these buffers. One useful bit of information is that the hippocampal cells, from what's been observed in recordings, seem not to be used for just very specific patterns. It's like one day they'll be involved in these patterns, and the next day, if you come back and you put them right in another environment, they're involved in some completely different set of patterns, experiences, visual things, whatever. So these cells are reused. That's very interesting. As a resource, they're not tied to a specific pattern of activity like the neocortical cells that are storing long-term information. Instead, they're being used as this pool of cells that you can use in whatever it is that you're doing with these hippocampal cells. Now, what is it that you're doing? Most of the neocortical cells that we talked about before, they have two kinds of important channels. They actually have many more, but these two we're just going to talk about. AMPA is for the transmission of activity while you're performing something. So let's say you need to drive a muscle. AMPA is just what causes the patterns to kind of flow from one place to another, activates the regions. NMDA channels are the channels that are involved in learning, in LTP. Now, normally we have a type of NMDA channel that's called a fast NMDA channel. It has a timing that is relatively quick. But these hippocampal cells in CA3, they have another kind of channel called the slow NMDA channels. And I should have added, oh, I did here. Okay, slow NMDA channels, and back again. They take long enough to cause their excitation to reach the other cells that they're connected to through recurrent fibers in CA3, that the one pattern that's firing in CA3 is going to cause an excitation in the next time slot of CA3 there, when the next pattern might be coming through. You know, if you look at this inhibition that the gamma is causing between patterns, it's when the next pattern is due, then that still has an influence through the recurrent fibers. So you can bind one pattern from one moment to the next one in CA3. You get temporal binding. What's more, you get temporal compression. So when you're experiencing things in the world, you don't know at what rate they're going to happen, meaningful things. And there are filters involved that we're not going to talk about. But let's say that, you know, you're watching an accident. Everything happens very quickly. So you have things that are happening within a second, and you have to just chuck all those into your CA3 recurrent buffer there. But at another time, you may be watching, you know, the play at a casino, and you've got, you know, the thing spinning, the ball goes around, and you see it drop in somewhere, and there could be a whole minute that goes by. So you don't know how much time is going to be between those. But as these new inputs come into that area, they appear during the acquisition phase, right, of that region, and retrieval of patterns happens at that other phase. So they can come in at any of these acquisition phases, and then they'll be put into the set of patterns that's reactivating, which I'll show you more about in just a second. And they get pushed in there. So again, just within the same theta cycle, very close together. So you've got compression of time, which is very useful if you want to be able to make binding of time happen, no matter how long the actual time difference was between different events. And I saw your hand go up, Arseny, so I can definitely call on you in just a moment. Okay, so yeah, another tie-in is the medial temporal lobes, because one of the things that was so important recently that it gave the Mosers a Nobel Prize in neuroscience, was this discovery of so-called grid cells. These are cells that will have a very regular patterned output for the input that they receive from whatever. It could be sensory, it could be like a rat running through a maze and that being information that is about the location they're in, but it could also be something completely different in humans where we use other kinds of input, even input from inside of us. And the grid cells map out a space, which I'll show you an example of in a bit. And that mapping together, they can precisely identify a location, a place, but that location doesn't need to be a physical location. It could be a concept location. So they're very useful for humans to do instant mapping into concept space. And these, again, are directly connected to the hippocampus, which in turn is all directly connected back with the neocortex. So all of this is part of the same system. Then we have another wonderful tie-in, which is the dentate gyrus. The dentate gyrus is in a position to cause excitation in hippocampus, to retrieve activity in hippocampus. And the dentate gyrus is at least hypothesized to be a place where we specify or generate new concepts. Now, if you're going to try to generate new concepts, it's very useful if you have cells that aren't already biased towards old knowledge. And it so happens that the dentate gyrus is the one place in the brain where we see a ton of neurogenesis, even in adults. So adult neurogenesis would be a remarkably useful resource for that purpose. Now, just to finish off this incredibly complicated slide, I want to mention that there is, of course, an alternative. There are alternative models of how short-term memory works or short-term buffers work, but I don't believe that they have as good a support. The most common one is called the so-called SynFire chains. So it's basically an idea that you have just, if you want to have a delay, if you want to be able to store a buffer, a set of patterns, you would need to have a number of neurons that are involved in these patterns connected through a chain, similar to how we have them connected through these recurrent fibers in CA3. But in this case, it would just not be a recurrent thing. It would be a chain, and maybe the chain has a loop at the end. The thing about the chains is that they don't directly explain some of what we see. For example, they don't explain why the memory would be limited to something like 7 plus or minus 2 items, which is often still quoted. But the newer research actually shows that for most types of information, it's more like 5 plus or minus 1. The exact number doesn't matter. The point is it's very limited. The nested oscillations, for which there is, of course, the evidence of the theta and gamma that we see, gives us that. It gives us, because of the timing of the interneurons and the timing of the theta, that there is only room for about 5 plus or minus 1 of these patterns before the next theta cycle happens. So there are reasons to believe that the SynFire chain model is at least not being used for that purpose. And now I see who's got hands up. Lennon's got a hand up, and Arseny already hand up. Arseny, yes, please.
Okay, actually, I would like to be the second, but all right.
Okay, Lennon first. How about Lennon first?
Yeah, so I had a question. So have there been any experiments done where within, I'd imagine rats, but it could also be in people, where specifically the theta and gamma rhythms were suppressed? I have a concern that it might be a byproduct rather than a foundational.
I can put that concern to rest. Yes, those tests have all been done. And indeed, when you silence gamma, you silence the interneurons, then you get what's basically epilepsy. And if you silence theta, then you do not get theta-mediated behavior. So you don't get this kind of episodic learning, and you don't get the kind of behavior where, say, a rat can find its way through a maze and that sort of thing. A lot of the recorded activity that you would normally see just goes away. So that's been done both through lesions and through temporary lesions by using a chemical process to lesion the input from the thalamic circuits or from the interneurons involved. Yeah.
What sort of behavior do you get when you silence theta?
Certainly not normal behavior, not the kind of behavior that you would see of a rat that is either exploring or performing well. In humans, I'm not sure exactly which of these experiments have been done in humans. I'd have to check. But I can tell you that this is stuff that has been explored either through lesions that happen to exist in people, medical conditions, but also through experiments, certainly in animals, in both rodents, but also in primates. And there is maybe 30 years of work in this. So the connection's pretty strong. This doesn't say that we can't still be wrong, but there's a lot of evidence. And Arseny.
Yeah, I just have two sort of simplifying bottom lines for two of the points here. I would like to check if they are somewhat correct, at least. The first is about this temporal binding and time compression. So is my understanding correct that this timed retrieval of information between layers is in some way allowing us to perceive things that have different span in time as single concepts? Like
yes,
that we can perceive as single concept, something that is long.
Yeah, that's true, but there's one other thing that I didn't mention that I should probably mention. It's it's one of the first things you learn actually in cognitive science, I guess, is that short-term memory, while it is known to be limited, because that's what psychophysical measurements and all of that shows us, even before we did any recording in neurons, it is also the case that short-term memory, even though it is limited in the number of items, or working memory, these two terms seem to be used almost interchangeably, the type of items changes, because if you are already familiar with items, you can chunk them, as they say, so that they become more complex items. So you can have a much more complicated thing where you remember 5 things that happened. Whereas if you've never seen them before, like if you've never seen a number before, it's hard to remember a telephone number with 7 digits.
Yeah,
Instead, you would have to learn what a 5 is first. And so that's one.
But then you can remember like a telephone number as a single thing, probably. With something.
Yeah, I mean, once the telephone numbers are familiar, if you've seen telephone numbers a lot, it's kind of like with names. If you've seen names like Peter, Bill, and Anita, and Gabriel before, then it's not too hard to remember 5 different names, even though those names are themselves composed of letters.
Okay. But this empirical limit of 7 plus minus 2, it is a single space for levels.
Yeah, so this means that the pattern
concepts
that you have to put into that buffer needs to then be referring to the more complex pattern, like the entire name. That means that the entire complex pattern has to be somewhere in neocortex already. And the neocortex, of course, also has a way of storing both complex patterns that are singular in time and of storing temporal sort of sequences you're aware of.
Okay.
All you need is a reference to it. So you can imagine the hippocampus being, if you're a computer person, you can imagine it as being a place where you work with pointers, and that you can have 7 pointers in there.
Yeah, exactly. It really comes into the last thing I wanted to ask on this slide. It's about this place cell mapping. So it's like a lookup table for concepts, is it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although the concepts that we mostly explore when studying rats are things like places in an environment, that they've run through. But it's known that the same circuit, the circuit in the brain that is responsible for episodic memory in humans, of course, is used for a whole ton of other things besides spatial navigation. Okay. So this is a quick aside for the people interested in AI. These neocortical models, like the visual system, that are typical in deep learning, they're often described as a pyramid of kinds because you've got information that's being integrated to be able to identify something. And often this other part, this thing that happens in the temporal lobes where the dentate gyrus and the hippocampus is, and this whole part is often considered the inverse pyramid that conjoins with that one, where you're not working just with elements that are all put together in the same time block, but that are kind of meaning the same thing, but at different conceptual levels. This is just a way of describing. It doesn't really mean too much, so don't dig into it too much. This is just for people who are aware of this pyramidal description and then say, oh, well, hey, I have heard that DeepMind and others are talking about the inverse pyramid for what the hippocampus does. Well, this is why. Okay, let's not make slides too complicated. Can you all read this? I'm kidding. This is just a poster. It's a poster that combines a lot of what you, Arseny, have already seen in the papers that you've gone through. And I'm just going to pick on pieces of that and highlight them to show some of what we just discussed. So yes, Lissman and the others were definitely the ones who first worked with all this information. You can find the references here as well if you want. But then at the Center for Memory and Brain, and with Mike Hasselmo as the PI, I spent quite a lot of time exploring these models as well. For since then, things have moved on, and there's probably better work out there as well. I'm just going to focus on a few bits. And maybe we can zoom back to this poster if we need it for something. So here we go. Click, Eddie, click. What do I want to show here? Let's see if I can make this clear. What we have here, A, B, C, D, E, and F, these are 6 different groups of neurons. Okay, so they don't represent a single neuron. If in the poster, the thing above that actually showed there being multiple neurons involved in each. But these are the neurons that fire together to represent one particular thing. And so here we have our, during awake active behavior of a rat or a person or a monkey, you have these oscillations of the membrane potential, and you can see effects on the membrane potential here. So you can see the effect of the interneurons causing these dips where the cells cannot fire. So that's the gamma inhibition, as it's called. You can also see here that there are spikes. There's the activity when these patterns occur. You can see that after the neuron fires, you have this deep valley, the after hyperpolarization, where that neuron cannot fire for a while. And then you see this climb. It's a pity that I didn't put in the resting potential here as well, because you can see this climb that actually goes beyond the resting potential and nearly makes its way all the way up again. But before this one could make its way up to firing, this other cell here fired. And so they all got inhibited by this interneuron network that they share. And it had to wait, and then it got its turn because it was lagging a little behind the others since its last time that it fired was here and the after hyperpolarization was still stronger. So you get that they are repeated in the same order as they came into the buffer. Now, a little aside for anyone who cares about LTP and how it's established, this concept of spike timing dependent potentiation, you say that there's going to be a positive connection, a strengthening of synapses when a cell fires before another cell, then that connection between those cells gets strengthened, but only when that firing happens within a certain window, not if it happens much, much, much later. And it's not coincidental that the interval that you get in this pattern here is the window where the slow NMDA channels can create in CA3 this spike timing dependent potentiation between these consecutive patterns that are happening here. And here, this part was, I don't know, this is not that important right now. This is really just showing that as new input comes in during the acquisition phase of theta, that can push out the earlier previous activity here due to the influence that that the activity of this interneuronal network keeps that first one from firing just as it should, and it doesn't make it, it dies. And so you get the replacement of an item in the memory and a new one put in. So this is just a detailed computational model of what's happening in these buffers. And if I go to the next one here, this is just showing you the connection between the different regions involved here. Entorhinal layer 2, that's part of the medial temporal lobes of the cortex. This is where you find ADP in those cells, so you get the repeated activity. And this is really an autoassociative area. So here you get fast NMDA and connections between neurons that form a pattern. They have a path that leads into the dentate gyrus, and from there into the hippocampus. And in the hippocampus, you've got the slow NMDA, and you also have, again, your interneuronal network that acts on everything, and you have theta coming in, which is just represented as a signal here, but actually, of course, it's synapses on all the neurons. It's just that sometimes you simplify when you make these models. So here you have these regions together operating to have both the autoassociative patterns as well as the episodic patterns being created in the hippocampus. And these are just a buffer that's available to all of the neocortex, all of the different kinds of input that you can have. And that is essential when you're doing this awake behavior. I don't think we have to get into this detail here. Now, before I move on to the next bit, are there any questions about the modeling so far? You can also tell me that I've completely lost you.
Yeah, it's a bit much.
Okay.
Well, this diagram is really difficult to understand. The previous picture was sort of clear for me, at least. Maybe because I've read some of the article.
Yeah, that might help. Yeah. Yeah, I admit this is kind of dense material. So I'll probably need to make a few more iterations of how to better explain this. And I'd love your input, Lennon and others, for that, because I really think that if we want to work at this level with concepts about memory, and especially non-synaptic memory and its involvement, and how we then view subjective experience, which I'll still get back into in a moment, then it needs to be possible to explain this to people. Yes, Anita?
I was just wondering if you would be making these slides available as well.
Gladly, and I'll also happily make other materials available that are, where this stuff comes from, like other references if you want.
Fantastic.
Yeah, just let me know what you need. And I'm really looking for feedback on how can we better present this. Like, what kind of an animated video could we make that would really show this for people, what we're talking about?
I would also really like to put together a podcast and have this be one of the Carbon Copies podcast episodes, although that would depend on, less visual dependent presentation.
Yeah. The reason why I think it's valuable for us to dig deeper into this and make it clear is because I'm going to tie it back into subjective experience, and then I'll have some examples of trying to go through what sort of experiences do we have and how can we imagine that they happen. And the reason to want to do that is to get people to think very clearly and carefully about what's really going on in the brain when, and to not be misled by the illusion of, because you're not aware of all the rest of, like, oh yeah, this is what's happening here. So I want us to be able to do that. I think it'll help us to maybe clarify some things that people might be bothered by when they think about whole brain emulation and mind uploading, and can that possibly be a person, and all this sort of stuff. So yes, I'm really looking forward to feedback. Okay, before we get back into the subjective experience, I felt like, because I mentioned grid cells before and concepts, it's useful to have a little look at how you can map out any concept instantly. But I'll just take the example of mapping any space instantly first, because concepts are no different than spaces, you just need different input. If you have visual input that's giving you spatial insight, then you can map any space, and this is what a rat does, by having a set of cells that already automatically generate these very regular patterns where this is from a single cell, one cell in the entorhinal cortex of a rat will generate activity. It will go ping, 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 ping when the rat is in this area. So this block here, this square, is a square environment that the rat was allowed to run around in. And whenever the rat was running here, ping, 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 here, silent. Ping, 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 silent. Ping, 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 ping. So the receptive fields, as it's called, which is just another name for synaptic pattern and what it causes in terms of output, the output produced by the synaptic pattern of these neurons in the entorhinal cortex is such that you get a regular pattern of activity in these spaces that the rat runs into. Now, a different cell has a different pattern. It pings here in an area that's a little different than this one, and you see it's also bigger. It's not as small as these. You actually have others that are even larger that will fill almost the entire space. You have some that are much smaller, that have another regular pattern, but that are smaller. Here you have a third one. And if you know about coordinate systems and how you can make coordinate systems and map a vector or a tensor using coordinate systems, then you can imagine that these grids here, they form a type of coordinate system. And if you put them together, if you do a little bit of this cell, plus a little bit of that cell, plus a little bit of this cell, then you can get activity that happens in one specific place. This is how grid cells feed into what's known as place cells. So place cell would fire only in one particular place. And this mapping is instantaneous. You take a rat and put it into an entirely novel environment that it's never been in before with new visual cues, and you already have a mapping. It's there. It doesn't need to develop or learn. This mapping is there. Grid cells, place cells, they exist. Now, in humans, these axes here, the x-axis and the y-axis of this environment that the rat's running in, they might not be spaces, spatial x-axis and y-axis. This could be something else, like, I don't know, what are we talking about? Like concepts about life and death or something like that. I don't know. Humans think about complicated things. And you could have very many of these automatic mapping cells helping you produce unique potential locations if you need them, if you need to have these so that you can then tie them into new memories, new experiences. Yes, Arseny.
Is there any information on whether these mappings are like reused in different contexts, or if there are many such mapping for different contexts separate from each other, or if there is one but such large that it includes all the contexts and all the things?
Yeah, actually both things have been seen. There has been evidence from studies that have changed environments just a little bit, or used environments that were similar in some sense, that the same grid cell mapping will map in a same sort of way to that other environment. But there has also been study evidence that when you do something different, like let's say you rotate the environment, that you can get an entirely new mapping. So that may be a little bit hard to explain, but you have to remember that these grid cells, these are not anywhere near the sensory input. So they've already gone through many levels of processing before you get to this level. That means that a specific change of features on the input could cause a complete change in whatever is being presented here at this level, further deeper into the network. Or if you're lucky, if you've made a change that just happened to be in the same conceptual space, I guess, then you might not get much of a remapping. So both things are true.
So I guess this is one of the ways how intuition might work, like on analogy with some
Maybe. I think
different
the most important thing to take home here is just that you have a resource
context.
that no matter how it interprets the input,
Yeah.
it can always instantly map out the space in a sense where you have a way of making these vectors that you can use as unique identifiers for that space that you can then use in your memory and in creating new concepts. So tying this back, what does a self-model need? Well, from personal experience, I think one of the things that in that loop we kind of went through, where there were only two things that were yellow, we could say awareness of detail is not really part of the self-model. But what it does need is some kind of concept level flags with which to make decisions, because at some level you need to be able to remember this happened and therefore I judge that, I don't know, I was conscious or someone said something or something like that. There need to be, at some level there needs to be these flags. You need to include both cognitive activity that's elicited by external input. So you need to be able, in your awareness, your self-model, to include signals that are related to whatever's happening on the outside, where the world is talking to you, and cognitive activity that appears internal. So, for example, planning and other personal things. For instance, aspects where your personal blueprint, what you were born with, or the learning that you experienced, is a filter that changes how you respond or how you internally react to something and what kind of experience you generate as opposed to someone else. So there needs to be this this personalization in a sense. Now, the side note I wanted to make here is just that neither of these things, the input from the outside nor what you're generating internally, are what you might call true nature representations of either a person or world, because as you may instantly sort of like understand, is that it can only work with, it can only process that which it is given. So it's not just that the processors and their connections matter, but also the data that you receive. So you're not going to be building world models that are automatically representing things about the universe that you can't detect, right? And the same way about yourself. Okay, so here we're going to get into the example part, which is actually the fun part, and the one where you can do some work. Let's do some examples. How do we generate awareness of subjective experience in these examples? The example, ouch, that hurt, or I'm excited, or I have a great idea. Let's think about computation here. Okay, first example, I'm going to call this the input-driven example. Let's just go through a list of things. This is not exhaustive, and I may have skipped a step that you personally feel should really be here, but I'll just go through it, and these are all time ordered, as in what's happening here. This is my model of what might be going on, and there's no real evidence here that this is exactly what's going on. It's an example using everything we know before about the memory buffers that are involved, about the necessity for such memory buffers, about the different parts of the brain that are involved, and all of that. And I'm just using that to try to come up with a plausible scenario of what's happening in these cases. So the input-driven one, some noxious stimulus impacts the skin. Noxious here just means something that will inflict pain. Peripheral nerve cells fire. Those, okay, the peripheral fibers, they send input to the central nervous system. Then subconscious countermeasures are already in progress. For example, a flood of adrenaline. That causes your blood pressure to rise. I mean, actually the heart rate accelerates first, then your blood pressure rises. Then motor cells in the extremity are activated. You already begin to withdraw your hand from a hot surface before you're consciously aware that you have to withdraw your hand from a hot surface. Countering the pain already begins. You get a flood of endorphins. Start to reduce the pain that you're feeling so that you can start concentrating on other things. At that point, in the neocortex, the processed sensation is in the non-synaptic short-term buffer. It has reached that point. Then in the neocortex, the associations with prior experiences begin to be made. You start using your memory to compare with what the heck is going on here. Attention is modulated using a body sensation map, so that you're trying to become aware of which part of your body is actually being inflicted here, being afflicted. Then you get proprioceptive input of the stuff that already started, the automatic body responses, your heart rate, the withdrawal of your hand, also begins to enter the episodic short-term memory buffer. So this becomes part of your experience of that episode. There's the pain, there's also the part where you're beginning to withdraw your hand and where you have all these sensations of heart rate racing and all that. Your medial temporal lobe, hippocampus, and dentate gyrus loop, the sequence of the experience is then available, as I was just describing here, to the cognitive evaluation. Experience is placed in relation to the self model. Resulting data is available then to prefrontal cortex judgments, plans, and execution. At that point, you have produced what we might call the realization, for example, from your other memory that you had, that, oh yes, there are others in the room here while this is happening. So you decide to comment on your experience. That's your plan. That's your big plan now. Then your prefrontal cortex wants to execute this plan for verbal expression. So language is generated, and you employ the working memory buffers again in that context because you need to put together a sentence. And those commands through your cerebellum go to your vocal cords, and you say, ouch, that hurt. This is the input-driven example. Do we have any questions about this one or interesting points? And again, here the yellow, again, is just sort of highlighting where the part of it that we can be consciously aware of, if we want to say that, is really in this yellow part. Okay. Then I'll happily go on to the next one. This one's more fun. Is it not going to show up? Is this it? Okay. The second one I'm going to call the one driven by the proprioceptive loop. Time points 0 to 2 are as previously. What's happening there is you're receiving a kiss on the cheek, and that input has reached your central nervous system. Now you have some responses that were already there from birth and some that you learned that have already begun, that have come into progress. There's a flood of adrenaline, also hormones. Then on the next step, your heart is accelerating, blood pressure is raised, your breathing speeds up, you get more oxygen. All of this oxygen helps upregulate principal neurons. You get greater sensitivity, brighter lights, elevated sound sensitivity. All of this is happening unconsciously. Automatic posture change and muscles that are orchestrated for readiness. Then in time point 7, the cheek sensation input, so this external thing, plus all that proprioceptive input, again, from your own body, they're in the short-term memory buffers and available to you. And they come from all kinds of different places in the cortex. The sequence of the experience is buffered in CA3, and it keeps on reactivating in a loop. So you're going through this loop in your working memory. The sequence of activity patterns causes retrieval of associated learned memories, like a sensation, emotional valence of previous occasions, other kisses that you've had. Then in time step 10, the active context that you're in causes additional retrieval. There's more stuff going on besides just the kiss. He or she is here. He or she attracts you or is dear to you. So you attach a positive valence and an emphasis to all of this that's going on, to the same pattern that's in your working memory already. The amygdala gets involved here. In time point 11, you do a comparison with known self states, so previous learning that drives the prefrontal activity at this point. Like, what are you going to do now, or what are you aware of? And that's when you realize, I'm excited. So you see, there's this whole part about the proprioceptive feedback from your body that's actually making you aware that you're excited. It's not as if that's just some magical thing hanging around in your soul going, oh, I'm excited. No, it's this feedback loop. And so at this point, I'm just going to not continue that example to keep this PG rating. Then we have our third one, which I'm going to call elicited by internal modes. So instead of being just about input or being mostly driven by this proprioceptive loop, here we have something that comes from an internal mode. We begin with, okay, you are holding something in working memory because you have been working on problem solving. You're trying to retain sequences that you're working with while applying learned operations of rational problem solving, like if this, then that. Step one after that, you're using known associations that elevate the likelihood of retrieval of known plans of attack, ways that you could solve this problem, things that are applicable, things that are situational, knowledge that applies. Associations are raising those, making it likely that they become part of your working memory, part of your working plan. In the next step, the prefrontal cortex is involved in applying comparisons and judgment. You have an internal model of the problem, or you're building it, and the approach is being constructed. The concepts are being assigned to what you might call stages, which you can then remember as, okay, I'm going to do this, and this, and this. This is being filled up in your working memory as the stages of a plan. You judge that there is now a complete solution available. The fact that you found this complete solution, it's natural that that sort of thing, good problem solving, is something nature wants to reward and wants you to be able to do a lot. So this triggers a dopamine reward, an excitation of principal neurons. That triggers adrenaline, elevation of heart rate, breathing, body temperature, your cheeks flush, your neck flushes. Proprioceptive feedback of physical response enters your short-term buffers. Proprioceptive feedback is then available to associative retrieval and comparisons, and the prefrontal cortex receives the result of those comparisons, and that's when you know, oh wow, my cheeks are all flushed, I'm so happy with this result, I have a great idea. And then you add that positive valence again to the context of that plan and store that away. So here we have these three different types of examples. Now, you'll notice that there were a few things missing, and they're actually meaningful that they miss. What's missing here is a holistic self-experience. There's very little of this. Even here in this example where the yellow and the white are kind of taking turns, there's a lot that is not available to the experience of self that just happens. So it's not really holistic in that sense, and it's just bits and pieces. And it's not clear that there's a distinct thing that is the subjective experience of it all. At every point, there are patterns of neural activity that are triggering other patterns of neural activity. It's this constant triggering, this loop that's going on while you have that theta activity and the availability of those short-term buffers. That's really the subjective experience. That's carrying the subjective experience, and the subjective experience is happening all throughout your neocortex. So there isn't really a distinct thing there besides maybe a distinct type of mode. You have to be in that awake mode and have that theta. Okay, now we're almost at the end of the talk, so maybe this is a good point to check in for questions and thoughts. It could be that I'm all alone now and everyone else has dropped off. Yes, Arsene.
Yeah, have I understood correctly that in this last example, it's meaning that the experience, the perception that I have a great idea depends on proprioception of the greatness of that idea being like represented in the body response.
Yeah, I think the meaningful clue here is that this bit, that the judgment that the complete solution is available, that's not enough to give you the sensation of a great idea, because there's more attached to that sensation of that. So, you know, the subjective experience of having a great idea, it needs that unconscious stuff that then happens, the dopamine reward and all of that physiological stuff that happens Once that comes back, then you've got the full picture of the experience of having just had a great idea. This one here before that could be a very academic kind of experience of having a great idea, but then it's not really a great idea. It's just, I have found a solution to your problem, Captain. Kind of the, you know, an emotional robot type of thing. But the real experience of having, I have a great idea, that involves all this other stuff. That's the subjective experience of it. And yes, that's where the proprioceptive stuff comes right back in again.
Okay, thanks.
Right. And the reason why I thought these were useful adventures into examples is because you can now take this to the next level. You can always ask yourself, well, what happens in this case? Or what happens in that case? What can we imagine is going on here? And so we can even apply that to questions that we have about the level of abstraction that's okay. So where's this separation that we can do? You know, how does that work into these examples or similar examples? Or we can think about questions of personal identity and try to walk through them in the same sort of way, where we're really looking at the path that something takes in the brain. And don't get distracted by just the notion of, oh, but it feels like this. No, imagine all of the things involved there. And it makes it much more clear what's, you know, in a sense, real and what's more just the illusion of how it is. I just think it's good to apply this kind of step-by-step thinking about what's actually happening, even though a lot of this is, of course, speculative. A lot of this is using models that are supported by some evidence, but then also a lot of speculative thinking of then, well, how could you make this happen? And why, where does this come from? What do we know? Well, we know something about dopamine and about heart rate and about how it affects and proprioceptive feedback. And so many different bits of evidence are combined here. And yet that's more precise and more useful in the sense that you can then test specific parts of it and either judge them to have been wrong and come up with a better result, or say, hey, that was actually quite good. We seem to have evidence for that using this. That's more useful in a sense than the type of just freewheeling, metaphysics about what's going on here. Not that I have anything against metaphysics. I just think that when we're trying to come up with emulation of the brain, it's useful not to be so freewheeling, but to try to make it all as testable as possible. And that's what we have here. So this is something I took out of a talk that I gave for Scott Jackish's group in the Bay Area once. This was just to then take some of these thoughts about how all of that subjective stuff works, to mention that it in fact aligns with attention schema and global workspace theory, which also has this sort of in the loop stuff going on, and that we can make here a list of how the functional complexity that is available in a specific animal or machine or computer program, and how that correlates with the cognitive capability right up to subjective experience. It's another way of looking at this, besides, say, for example, the way that integrated information theory looks at things. And I've noted here where that actually says something. So we could say, for example, that of all the things that are needed to get to the full subjective experience with the entire cognitive capacity involved, most of the AI that we have now, the narrow AI and neuromorphic devices and all of that, they fit in this category where it's reactive to input-output. It produces output as a reaction to input, has a fixed response, even if it's a learned one. So associations may have been learned, but they're fixed because you can't do any more learning. It's just been pre-trained and then put into a device. Then you have the version that's a little bit more modern, where you don't just do the learning as you're developing your app and then you make your app available, but instead you still have learning involved. And I remind you that I'm not just talking about computer programs. This could also be animals. You could have, some kind of animal that is very fixed, like the nematode that maybe has one particular network, versus, say, Drosophila that has some learning or something like that. Now, nematodes aren't completely fixed, so it's a bad example. But you can have learning involved in the system, the plasticity that's there, the adaptations, that's kind of the next step here. Then you've got your feedback loops. So you don't just have a forward system that has some learning in it, but you have the ability to include your own output in your learning. So recurrent auto-associative loops there. These are necessary for scalable and stable error correcting and all that sort of stuff. This is actually where IIT begins to make statements. It sort of judges the degree of capability at this level. If you have a network that has a certain number of inputs, that has recurrence in it, IIT can calculate for you some value that is supposed to make a statement about how capable this system is. Then you can have the modular breakup, that you don't just have a single network with that loop in it, but you have all these different modules responsible for different things, because a more elaborate complex system can be made in a robust and reliable way if each of those modules does only a specific thing really well and they work together. And this is actually interesting because at this point, even though that leads to the even higher cognition, this is actually a point where the IIT metric can drop, because you suddenly don't have this full connectivity between everything. You've got regions. So you're more stupid? I don't know, something like that. And then you get abstraction and conceptual state modeling. So the self model being involved here, why being a human with a subjective experience is a particular experience. This is sort of the last little step on top of the modularity. And we talked about that at length, so I'm not going to get into that right now. Yes, Artany.
Yeah, for the 4 previous stages, I can understand very primitively, but still sort of circuitry behind it, some effectors and then feedback loops, and then these loops are split into regions. But the last one is, well, I can
then I should probably talk about it a
map
bit
it in this sense, yeah.
Yeah. So to have a self model, you need to have an abstract representation of yourself, even if it's one that you're not consciously aware is an abstract representation of yourself. And to be able to make concepts, make abstract representations, you need some system to be able to do that with. We talked a little bit about some of the circuits that actually can be used to make these kinds of abstractions, to be able to chunk, to be able to learn new concepts. So I think it's not as important to try to detail again what those pieces were, but just to say that just like all the other 4 systems here, we're about having a specific kind of circuitry and having activity within that circuitry, dynamics within that circuitry. The same is, of course, true here too. This is also about having circuitry that provides certain capabilities that we discussed before, and those being in the loop, being part of the flow of activity from neuron to neuron. So in that sense, of course, it's all part of the brain, and it's all built out of those kinds of components. And in that sense, it's nothing very different. It's just that it includes this modeling aspect. Now, you could be modeling the world around you, like a rat maybe does, to model the space around it and to map out conceptually where everything is, to have a spatial understanding of where to find things. And the same way, you can be modeling yourself. You can be modeling where you are in this space, and you can be modeling the parts of your body, and you can be modeling what the auditory input was once you've processed it and you've realized someone's speaking to you, and you can be modeling the sensation you just had once you've already abstracted that and you go, well, that felt hot, or something like that. So it's just another type of modeling, where modeling is something that you already do for many, many other reasons in the brain as well.
Yeah, I just don't see that it is necessary distinct stage from, for example, the modular one. Maybe modular stage is enough for that.
Yeah, I would say that that's true. It's not really distinct. It doesn't add a very fundamental new kind of circuit capability, in a sense. I would agree with that. I think the only reason to put it here separately is because it's the focus of so much discussion about what makes the human experience unique, the subjective experience. But I don't think that from a resource perspective, from the capabilities perspective, that it is unique. It doesn't introduce quantum mechanics or something. It doesn't suddenly give you like, oh, we need quantum computing to make that possible. Actually, that would be one of my points, is it does not need something like a quantum brain to have consciousness. Okay. All right, bonus question before we tie things up. Now, having heard all of this, and I'm actually don't have an answer for this one, but I just wanted to throw it out there. If you consider this kind of a chain and the mechanisms involved, why might a soul, self, or homunculus appear as obvious as the existence of other people when your brain works in the way that those examples just ran? What could make you feel like there is this other person inside you? Yes, Anita.
My guess would be that the model is something you feel to be distinct and not part of the same process. So like when you have that last stage and you're doing your abstraction, for some reason you have the emotion of feeling like it's its own thing.
So the
rather than-
emotion of that feeling like it's its own thing, kind of like you become aware of the proprioceptive feedback as if it could be input from somewhere else. It's sort of like,
Right,
just like
like
you're aware of
maybe-
someone else talking to you, you
Right.
kind of have the same experience of your own body reacting to things in a way. And that makes
So
it
perhaps
just as
it's
distinct
not
as another
distinct.
person.
Mhm.
Good thought.
Idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I've actually figured this one out. I'm just curious because I see it happening all over the place. I see so much intrinsic dualism in the way people state things, say stuff, what they worry about, and so forth, where the only thing they could possibly be worrying about is really some separate, maybe immaterial thing that wasn't already covered when we talked about the brain and the brain's activity. Yeah. Now we can still keep on talking about this, of course, but before we do, I just want to make sure that I don't forget this. In this slide, I just say what I hope to do with it. So I really hope to improve this further by getting feedback on it. And so maybe when I send out the materials, then you can also give me feedback on it. I'd love it if we can produce a video, maybe something else, I don't know, but I thought that maybe an animated video might be a good idea to try to walk through things. And then I thought maybe we can include that in some of the materials we have, and maybe the wiki and whatever else needs it. And many, many thanks to both Anita and Keith. And did I forget someone else who was at that discussion? Lennon, were you there?
Yeah.
You were? Yeah?
Mhm.
Okay, then I should have thanked you as well. So there's one correction for these slides already. Yeah, thank you very much for that conversation. I've been meaning to give this talk ever since then. So we can either just quit here because we've had enough to process, or we can converse a little bit about it, however you feel.
I do think it might be fun to make maybe more than one animated video based on it, because I really liked the scenarios and how you can apply these processes. There are different ways that they could be implemented to an emotion or a thing that is felt, and I could see how that could translate nicely into like an animated video. So
I think
Jesse's not here anymore, but I think he would agree too.
I think an animated video that went over these T's to 0 to 15 in like a clearly sequential step-by-step way would be like a direct kind of response to the implicit dualism that you're identifying. Like I think it really, at a subjective level, if you don't mind using that lingo, kind of combats that whole framework.
Okay, so then definitely these examples are a good point to do animation. Great, yeah, I think so too. I still don't know what to do with the modeling part before. It's so involved. Sometimes it helps though, if those are animated, if you can actually see how activity is happening and then something fires and you say something about it, that can be helpful, I find.
Yeah, if we could do, I don't know how. Well, yeah,
Like,
probably
what if we
there could
even
be some.
had an animation of the model going on at the same time as this stuff?
Yeah, as long as it's just not too much in one moment, of the video. I think it would be great if we could get those explanations in a way that's accessible.
Hmm.
And it might involve, these are the background things, and it could, I don't know, this might be too ambitious, but leading people through the stages of being able to understand those complex graphs and complex
Yeah.
diagrams.
We could do a 12-part tutorial computational neuroscience course on learning how to work with the model.
Specifically for this.
Using BrainGenix as the platform. Yeah. That is something to do.
This is
Create
something
your
if
own
we
realization. So instead of create your own adventure,
It's
create
just
your
my
own
mind immediately went to the wrong place. I was like, and in the game, you have to be the homunculus, and it's your job to make the heart beat faster. And then,
that's an awesome idea.
except it's so
well,
wrong.
my
because then you're
idea
making
was-
that, like,
awesome.
yeah.
Sorry. I had also an idea for a game, though I really don't know if it would be useful in any sense. But the idea was like a distributed game, multiplayer game where you have to take on part of, for example, first you take a role of a single neuron and you have to produce certain output. Then you level up and you become a few neurons and so on.
It is your job to
And-
compete with the other patterns to see which pattern reaches the output first and is chosen as.
Yeah, and together as multiplayer game goes on, you act as something more complex.
Yeah. Can you grow your synapses faster than the other players? I don't know what that means.
Just also want to say for the record, if we do any sort of game development, I'm very confident I can help.
That's good.
This is something I think I'm actually very naturally gifted at, or maybe not naturally, but
Well, that's great to know. The founder of DeepMind, his first career was in game development, where he made his fortune, and then he decided to go into neuroscience and become a professor there before he created DeepMind. So that was through video games.
did you say Piedmont?
DeepMind.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
Yeah. So the company DeepMind, right? The AI company.
Gotcha.
There's something I'm forgetting here. Yeah, I guess my biggest concern and what I'm hoping for feedback from people who were there at that conversation is, did I forget something important that we had? When in those conversations late at night, you have these realizations and you're like, wow, this is all so amazingly amazing and important and stuff. And then the next day it's hard to remember exactly what it was. I'm a little worried that I might have forgotten something.
No, I feel it because I wrote a bunch of things down right after because I didn't want to forget, and I think everything that I cared about anyway was covered, I think.
Good, great, fantastic. So then, what would you all like to receive in return? You want to get the slides, and maybe what else would you like to have from me?
Were the sources in the slides as well? Because some of them I couldn't fully see on my screen, so they might.
Yeah, like the model when I was showing those figures in there. You mean, for example? Yeah. Okay. So that certainly also.
Yeah. Any sources or, recommended background material too, for those of us that aren't going to see it and just get it, might be helpful.
I'll put that together too.
Awesome.
Yeah. So now my big question on the end of this all is any of this going to help us straighten out how people talk about and think about subjective experience for the purposes of carbon copies, and maybe help us gradually get to a point where we don't have to keep starting from the beginning every time someone asks us, but how about consciousness? Or something like that.
You're asking how can we use
Is
this
it going to
make
help?
that-
Is this helpful at all? Or is it just going to confuse people? I think it's not really going to confuse people, but I mean, once we explain it well, it's not going to confuse people. Just wondering
Yeah.
how much it covers ground in the area of making people feel comfortable with, yeah, an emulation of a brain can also be conscious. It can have subjective experience because look, it can do that loop. Something like that.
I'm not sure it'll address concerns of people who are familiar with like the hard problem literature. It might address a lot of like just people who have familiarity with these ideas. And I think if we make a video that goes through these T0s to T15,
Okay, interesting.
these examples.
Because I was actually hoping that people who did wonder about the hard problem might actually benefit particularly from these examples and from this sort of thinking. Because the hard problem, this notion of, well, but where is the sensation of this is what it's like to be experiencing that? This is basically giving you a scenario where you never have to ask that question, because the sensation of what it's like to be experiencing that is all of these different steps. And the fact that at one point you're becoming aware of the proprioceptive feedback, and that is affecting the output that you're producing and is giving a kind of valence to the memory that you're storing away. And so these steps here that are showing how something's actually potentially being done in the brain as part of a circuit, to me at least, it removes some of the, well, what does this mean about why do we have this experience? Because the why is no longer a big why. It's no longer a why about the whole thing. It's not just one holistic, no, give me an answer as to why the whole thing feels a certain way. Instead, it's become lots of little whys that you can give answers to, where you can say, well, and then this happens, and then that happens, and that's why you're getting this piece of the experience and that piece of the experience. So to me, this granularization, breaking it down like this, is what makes you start to think, well, if this is how it works, why should there even be a hard problem?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that for some people that line will be very striking. But I think what I was saying is I think some people like more engrossed in the literature will, I think they still might have objections.
Mm-hmm.
I think like the hard problem being about why the I don't know, higher order phenomena of the kind that we're referring to emerges from the more basic components. I still think that there's probably some heated debates that can go on about that.
Right. Yeah, we would need to do some more granular explanation of something like realization. So you, for instance, have to break that down to well, there's some process going on of comparison that produces an output. That output becomes part of this other thing that you usually do, and then something gets stored away over here. You have to break that down even more to get rid of the big terms that are still sort of stand-ins and that can get in the way, where someone says, well, there's still a higher order problem here. Mm-hmm. A realization seems to be something that really is happening outside of the brain, because how can you realize something? But then we'll say, no, realization is, of course, also a process. Realizing something means that you have a situation and you have compared it with things you've come across before, and then that has produced some kind of an output, and then you use that in a certain way. And then once you explain all those chain bits, then you again finally get to a point where you can say, okay, this big term has been broken down enough that it no longer seems magical.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, enough about this. I think we have another call to get into. So if you guys are all okay with it, then I think Thomas can stop the recording.